Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests and colleagues. I warmly welcome you to this evening's lecture by David Kohn, part of the international lecture series of A+ Architecture in Belgium and Beaux-Arts. Since Hall M is under restoration, we are gathered here in the spacious Henri Leboeuf Hall. Please feel free to sit closer together, but I think you already did that. David Kohn is the founding director of David Kohn Architects. Established in London in 2007, his practice has earned an international reputation in culture, education, and housing, with a sensitivity to context, heritage, and material reuse. For David Kohn, architecture protects the openness of decision-making, ensuring diverse voices contribute to the outcome. He emphasizes that today's challenge is to navigate tensions and create work that is both exceptional and solution-oriented. In a world in constant flux, architecture must be self-aware and adaptable. Yet, he believes sustainable design inevitably requires lightness and some humor. Among his best-known recent works are the Greenwich Design District in London, completed in 2022, and New College, Oxford, inaugurated in 2024. Projects that go beyond form to create experience, identity, and community. Dans le Design District de Londres, 16 bâtiments conçus par 8 architectes, David Kohn a réalisé 2 bâtiments ateliers, A4 et B4. Ils offrent des espaces de travail abordables et pleins de caractère pour créatifs et encouragent une communauté dynamique. L'architecture s'inspire du classicisme tout en faisant des clins d'œil ludiques à d'autres périodes. Des palais vénitiens richement ornés aux architectures routières américaines du Midwest, chères à Venturi et Scott Brown, jusqu'aux œuvres tardives de James Sterling. Ces bâtiments créent et transgressent les règles, espérant inspirer leurs occupants. À Oxford, les Gradle Quadrangles du New College réinterprètent la tradition du quadrilatère universitaire. Kohn y a conçu des cours et bâtiments interconnectés dans un style contemporain. Selon The Guardian, Oliver Wainwright décrit le projet comme l'une des additions les plus inhabituelles du paysage historique d'Oxford, dense en sens et allusions. Au sommet, un pangolin sculpté, un poulpe, un papillon et une taupe durée symbolisent des espèces menacées, illustrant l'usage de l'ornement et de la narration dans l'architecture. Ces sculptures évoquent le dérèglement climatique, notre relation changeante avec la nature et la manière dont de tels thèmes peuvent être tissés dans la matière même de l'architectuur. Hier in België draagt David Kohn bij aan 2 toonaangevende projecten. In Gent won zijn bureau samen met Noah en Asle Zizek de internationale wedstrijd voor de uitbreiding en vernieuwing van het SMAK. De historische Floralienhal wordt heropend als nieuwe ingang. Bestaande structuren worden zorgvuldig gerenoveerd en er komen sterkere verbindingen met het Citadelpark en de stad. Duurzaamheid, hergebruik van materialen en erfgoedintegratie staan centraal. In Hasselt, samen met bovenbouwarchitectuur en Land in Zicht, werkte Kohn aan de transformatie van het Begijnhof, onlangs opgeleverd. Het project restaureerde 13 historische Begijnenhuizen, integreerde de faculteit architectuur van de Universiteit Hasselt en voegde nieuwe ingrepen toe. Een de omgeving reflecterende vijver, een publieke tuin en een uitkijktoren van 26 meter. Het ontwerp behoudt het verleden en laat erfgoed opnieuw leven, door paden te openen, toegankelijkheid te verbeteren en de site te verbinden met het ritme van de stad. Before giving the floor to David, I want to warmly thank those who made this lecture possible, our main sponsor tonight, Assa Abloy, our public partners, de Vlaamse overheid, la Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, Cellule d'Architecture, Urban, and the City of Brussels. And A+ is always thankful to its structural sponsors, Febelsem, Pierre & Marve, and D'Ieteren. Finally, I would like to mention that Léon Drapeau interviewed David Kohn for A magazine, A+ magazine, Issue A+313, Parallel Practices, is available tonight at the Bota Shop stand. Next week we launch A+314, Collective Authorship, co-edited by West, whose exhibition Urban Legend opens next month on October 14th. Well, that's less than a month from now. It is my great pleasure to invite David Kohn to the stage. At his request, we'll hold a Q&A session after the lecture. Please prepare your questions. He'll be happy to answer them.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you both to A+ and Beaux-Arts for the introduction. I have a lecture, it's about 50 minutes, and it's about our London-based practice. We've been going for nearly 2 decades, and increasingly our work is in Belgium. So I'm delighted to be able to give you an introduction to our work. So I think the lectures, the title that you saw was Meet the Architect, and I think it's probably fairer to say Meet the Architects. I'm here on behalf of a group of collaborators, and as anyone who works in practice knows, architecture is very much a team sport, and even though my collaborators have changed over the years, they're critical to delivering the work. And between us, we are constantly trying to refine what are the ideas that we share at work and how do we communicate that as succinctly as possible. This is the shortest it's ever become, which is probably to your benefit. So ORCA, openness, rigor, and care. So these are the things that, when we try to boil down what it is that we're doing project to project and year to year, these 3 words have been very useful. Openness, so we want to be open to each new context. That's both the physical context, the history, the people that live there, our clients, the people who are going to make projects. We want to be live to the present conversation. Rigor, I guess the complement of the openness is having a process whereby each of these new encounters can become folded into a consistent design methodology. So we try to be really clear with each other and communicate how we're doing things sufficiently that openness can actually become core to the project. And care, this is both for the environment, as we're all aware that's increasingly a priority. It's also care for our clients and those that live and work in the environments that we're involved with. And lastly, to return to the team, care for each other. Again, if you're involved in practice, you will know that it can be a very challenging environment today as much as any other time, and we spend a bit of effort trying to look after each other. So in that context, I want to show 5 projects, and I have 5 ideas that I want to share with you, and hopefully the projects will illustrate some of these ideas. Experience, gestalt, intricacy, renewal, and figuration. Experience. So this is a drawing from 1819 by Henry Park of a student measuring the Temple of Castor and Pollux in Rome. And it's in the Sir John Soane Museum collection. And I love this drawing. I love it because it's very much about a kind of performance, an act. There's some kind of jeopardy. One feels like architecture could be terrifying, not least because of the exposure this student has to endure in order to get to the capital, but also the kind of monstrous scale relative to this small figure. And I think it says something about the need to visit places, to travel, to experience architecture firsthand. I think what I would commend to students before anything is to go out and see places and gather in your imaginations a catalogue of all the possible ways of making things, inhabiting spaces. And I think also Rome is an incredibly important city. When I was a first-year student in the UK, the whole year group got taken to Rome. Now, they didn't let us do this, but we did get to visit extraordinary architecture. I had never been before, and it has had a deep influence on my career. When I've had the opportunity to teach, I've taken my students to Rome, and increasingly the work in the practice is concerned with addressing questions around the future of classicism. I have a role in 2007 as a visiting professor of classical architecture, so I really have to gen up on the subject. The second idea is Gestalt. This is an untitled drawing by the British artist Bridget Riley from 1965. I have a passion for art. I briefly was at art school, and I feel there's a huge amount for architects to learn from artists, and I chose this particular drawing because there's so much that's unexpected. There's the face value of the image, and one feels like one perceives the whole immediately, but then actually, the more one looks at the parts, one realizes the complexity of it, and also how this kind of the geometry that is built of straight lines starts to morph into all sorts of other more complex forms. And this feeling of doubleness, the kind of what you see is what you get, and then the disquiet of all the other things that are going on, I think is a quality that often artists bring into our world, and it's something that I think architecture can also achieve or aspire to. Next is intricacy. This is a Roman wall painting from around 70 AD. It's called the fourth style. So there were three preceding styles. It's sometimes called the intricate style. And it's Baroque in its nature, meaning it takes the previous styles and somehow elaborates on them. And it's of the Domus Aurea, not the best quality image, apologies. But what I think the image and the style speaks to is a desire for depth, for layering, for ambiguity, that there is the architecture of the wall, and then the architecture of the frame, but there's also the architecture of the window, and then there's captured landscapes, animals, a kind of fantastical world that is only the depth of a wall. And I think, probably architectural culture for many decades has wanted to exclude some of this intricacy. It's seen as maybe bourgeois, excessive, unnecessary, not part of function. But I think its function is to alight the imagination, to make dreaming possible in the present tense, and architecture is a route to that dreaming. Renewal. So this is an appeal to the pleasures of fiction. These are short stories about materials, but they're how contemporary architecture may be made of past buildings, both metaphorically and literally. I feel that is culturally where we are heading. the idea that we must make new architecture out of exactly what we have on the site as we find it. The idea that fiction might actually be a way to address the climate crisis through allowing people to imagine how what they presently have and is around them is actually the grounds for holistic renewal. One doesn't need to build from scratch. There is no need for a tabula rasa. And these short stories I wrote a decade ago and about to be published in our first monograph by Koenig Books in November. And lastly, figuration. So this is partly here for Marius Groepveld and Jantje Engels, who I hope are here, but they organized an exhibition that was in London in 2014, I think. Oh no, sorry, 2019. Alternative Histories, and a number of architects, I guess many might be here, were invited to make a model that referred to a drawing, and the drawing was in a collection of drawing matter in London, and we were given a John Haydock drawing. Some of the projects I'm going to show you in a minute are inside these figures, so a bit like the fiction of architecture cannibalizing architecture. I think eventually, at some point in your career, and maybe we're 20 years in, so maybe it's happening now, there's not only the world that you encounter, there's also the world of the studio and all the projects that you've worked on, and they accrete, and they become part of not just my imagination, but our colleagues' imaginations. And this becomes the possibility of an architecture that reconfigures your work. And here there are 5 figures, and that's alluding to also the drawing, which has figures in it. But here they are figurative, the idea that they actually take on not an abstract character, but a figurative character. They are identifiable in the way that bodies are identifiable. They are memorable for those reasons. And there's a pleasure in that identification, in that memory, which I think can be very much a part of architecture. So, those ideas, I hope now to illustrate through 5 projects. They are in chronological order, and the first 3 are in the UK, and then I'm pleased to say the last 2 are in Belgium. So first up is the Red House. So you can see it nestled in the landscape. This is in rural Dorset. It is on the one hand a very ordinary house, or at least it is trying to appeal to ideas of ordinariness. On the other hand, it is exceptional. It's for a gallery owner that we've worked a lot with, and it was a home for his family. And in calling it the Red House, we perhaps deliberately placed it in a long history of red houses. This is William Morris's Red House, designed with Philip Webb in 1859. And if you can believe it, in its day, this was shocking. Shocking because it was all made of one material, which was not what was done at the time. So it started to have a plastic, sculptural presence. At the same time, this became, the arts and crafts house, the arts and crafts English house, became the kind of quintessence of domestic architecture, and much referred to throughout the 20th century. This is perhaps what Red House means to most people living in Britain today. The majority of housing is built by 5 large house builders, and there is a very ubiquitous form. Red brick is the chosen material, and so the Red House is also the house that is every man's. It was this interest in the ordinary and the extraordinary, and how to make a home in a rural context that would speak to both, that led to trying to wring out of architectural styles a kind of Baroque nature, a bit like the intricate style. So this is a house, again, one that I've visited many times. It's well known in the UK for lovers of the arts and crafts movement. It's Blackwell by Bailey Scott from around the turn of the 20th century. I've marked out a couple of things that are very typical of the era. The corridor, so a means to segregating people which reflects a certain austere social life, which was very Victorian, and all the rooms being built off it. So this question of like, well, what in a kind of contemporary world has the corridor become? At the end is a drawing room, and this photograph, you might think it's the whole room, but in fact, it's the little bay at the end that the arrow points to. So again, there was this kind of interest in, that seems to be where all the pleasure is, this bay, this little room that extends beyond the large room, a bit like the intricate style, the miniature architecture within the larger, and thinking, how does one achieve a kind of Baroque pleasure? And I think we alighted on the idea that this house would be all bays, as many bays as it could possibly achieve. And the corridor would become a much more meandering affair, where it would not separate but join all of the rooms in the house. So it's the ground floor below, the first floor above. The idea of introducing multiple bays, they're no longer the small bit of pleasure that is part of the larger room. It is now that every other space is delivering this generous view out to the landscape in different directions. And between them are very large storage units that run from the ground floor through to the first. This idea of a corridor that is for separation, becoming a corridor that's for bringing people together. There are no doors, so you are always aware of others in the house. We then inflected these storage cores so that you only got diagonal glimpses from one room to another. So whilst the whole floor is open, there is privacy introduced through this kind of chicane. And the use of these storage rooms to separate out all of the social spaces was a reference to Alison and Peter Smithson's storage house, which was, I guess, a polemic about consumerism and our relationship to objects, which I think has only become greater, where the entire house revolves around a room where everything that you need for a kind of comfortable domestic life is stored. And you could take it out and put it back through the course of the day. So quite unlike a Palladian villa, which the rooms seem exclusively about, say, addressing the outside, here there's a connection to the outside, but also this kind of intense inner life of objects. So the facade, on the one hand, is this rather ordinary, you might say, house. It conforms to the kind of drawing a child might do of an English red brick house. But then it has these games of an oversized eaves, these excessive bays, if you take the arts and crafts as your benchmark. And then the brickwork turns 90 degrees to reinforce on the facade these storage towers. Now this led to the question, is this post-modernism? Which is probably the kind of question you want if one's trying to both make something ordinary and extraordinary. This is actually what was there, which by the time the client had bought it was crumbling, and the location was roughly similar in this strip of land. And now, I'm conscious of time, I'm going to flick through some slides that give you a bit of a sense of arrival and the journey, so I'll try and keep a bit of a pace. So you're coming up the lane, you see over the hedge, the bays, the face of the brickwork, this roaming bullseye window. The entrance adjacent to one of the other bays, but in one of the vertical cores. And we're about to go in, just to revisit the plan, so into the entrance at the bottom, the staircase centrally. Ooh, I might even have a... Oof. Right, we're going to go in here, stairs there, past the kitchen, dining, and there's 2 living rooms, and you can see this kind of chicane. You'll see the bays addressing outwards, up the stairs. Here there is a straight corridor to the children's bedrooms and the master bedroom. So this is Stephen Friedman, the client. He's been a fantastic client. We did a number of galleries for beforehand, and his family. So this is, say something about the geometry of the room, that the bay is so large, and that when it interacts with the fireplace, it makes the room in the round. So there's no longer a hierarchy between the room proper and the little architecture. The little architecture and the room are now conjoined. So again, this pleasure in geometry and the kind of confounding of first appearances. So perhaps what isn't immediately obvious, these are flat ceilings. This is a bay window, and this is that corner chopped off for the fireplace. But it ends up having this tent-like quality, even though everything is solid. It has a lightness that's just a consequence of intersecting geometries. And that is reminiscent of this famous Schinkel tented room, where the architecture is almost like the kind of original Bedouin tents as a domestic environment. So to project 2, it's the design district. It's in Greenwich, so this is in East London, and this is a drawing from the 19th century. It's by Henry Pether, and would you believe it, that by the end of the 19th century, well, you would, I guess Belgium went through similar things, but the kind of amount of development on the peninsula is extraordinary. It became a site of a lot of gas and chemical works with the incumbent houses for workers. In my lifetime, it became famous again as a post-industrial site for the O2 Arena, as it's now called, or Richard Rogers Dome, that was built for the year 2000, and there's Tony Blair excitedly awaiting the festivities. You can see the dome on the end of the peninsula, and all of the white buildings are one of the largest residential master plans in the UK, certainly in London, for a Hong Kong-based developer. And we weren't asked to do any of the white stuff. We were one of 8 architects asked to work on this, which was the planning authority's invitation to make it much more of a piece of city, that it wouldn't be this monoculture of residential accommodation, but would have spaces to work, and they particularly required that they be spaces for like rent-capped creative studios. So this was an early rendering of the 16 buildings, and our 2 faced the street on the edge of the site, so A4 and B4. And the plan had something of a kind of souk-like feel, very dense. The buildings are incredibly small, so from a kind of commercial point of view, they don't make a lot of sense, but you can understand the commercial point of view was really looking outwards at the residential development. And here you can see it built, and its relationship to Canary Wharf, and this building will keep reappearing, which is Caesar Pelli's tower, which was kind of famous for having a pyramid on the roof and being the kind of first Pomo tower. First, and it was the beginning of the end for postmodernism, that tower, I'm afraid. And our building, our 2 buildings here, became like the entrance to the entire district, not because that was what was asked of us, but because we read the site as having a street that needed a frontage, that needed some gesture that wasn't only about our building, but was about arrival at a wider district. And again, with a kind of passion for mining other architectures, these were some of the references as a kind of Rossi, learning from Las Vegas, the kind of idea of sign architecture at the speed of the kind of motorway, the strip, and that's from Venturi Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas. The Maison de Verre in Paris, again, a very strangely scaled building. It's only when you look at the windows above that you realize it's really at the scale of a small apartment building. There's something about the gridded nature of the facade, this kind of abstraction that means that its scale is completely ambiguous. And lastly, Venetian scuole, the idea of buildings made for groups of craftspeople that can have iconography, figures of patron saints, the kind of sculptural skills of the workers embedded in the appearance of the building. So our response to the client's brief of making small palazzi that could accommodate creative uses was to make buildings in which all of these different types of architecture, all the different registers of how architecture can communicate, from the symbolic to the abstract, would be combined in one building, whether that's at the scale of the sign, to do with the motorway that passes in the distance, the colonnade on the ground floor being oversized, the grid masking how many floors the building actually has, and then populated with figurative sculpture, both permanent and temporary. We designed niches and bays and podia for sculpture. I didn't actually realize that the client had a passion for Damien Hirst and actually owned one and then commissioned another. So the next thing we knew it, we had 2 Damien Hirsts on the corner of the building, which I think perhaps demonstrated that scale and intricacy are already guidance enough for what would work with the building, even though I couldn't have anticipated that these would be the works that would be there. And we worked with Mark El-Khatib, a graphic designer, on a font that was like the building with its truncated corners, and this is now visible from the motorway that passes by the site. And again, you get this sense of the huge scale of the surrounding city and the desire to make a small building that appeared bigger than it was. So this kind of, it's like kawaii, the idea, this kind of Japanese concept of aesthetics that are to do with the diminutive. So a child has large eyes relative to its face as part of how it appeals. And architecture, I think, to some degree, operates similarly. And a colleague in the office did a number of tests for this glazed facade. How could we make a grid that would be concealing of the interiors but change through the day depending on the light conditions and whether it's internally or externally illuminated. And so this is our office in London where we kind of did these tests and went and stood across the road. And the entire facade eventually was silkscreen printed with this pattern that's opaque enough to conceal depending on the time of day, and at other points kind of comes alive with a very kind of strong three-dimensional appearance. And here's the view from the corner, the kind of truncated corner, back towards Cesar Pelli's original postmodernism. Is this post-postmodernism talking to its kind of older relative, perhaps? And the second building, which has these bays that were pushed in order to receive temporary sculptures, with each of the sills having loading points, so that anyone working in the design district has the specification for what can be accommodated in there. And again, I kind of feel like small gestures, like adding this balcony, are what architects can do to bring more pleasure, more joy to the urban environment. And this is to point out the kind of interest in Hermann Czech and his work. This is at the Staatsoper in Vienna, where he created this temporary screen that's inserted every winter in order to make the balcony useful in the cold weather. A very modest version. So the third and last project in the UK is for New College at Oxford University. So this took 9 years, which is half as long as the practice has been going, so it was a real effort. And this is the historic campus of New College. It's an incredibly beautiful series of buildings. It's famous for being the first ever purpose-designed and built in a single-phase quad. So, particularly if you go to American universities and they're all based around quadrangles, they're modeled on New College. And being the first was about this kind of thing. So this is the St. Scholasticus Day massacre. This is townsfolk beating up students. So town and gown in the 14th century was a real serious, violent affair. You can imagine a small market town with lots of young men traveling from all over the country to get an education. They were not always welcome. So a quad was a way of segregating the institution from the city. It's quite prison-like in its model. All the buildings that would have been previously distributed throughout the city that students would have traveled to were now combined in a kind of mixed-use single space, a bit like a monastic building before it. So in the 14th century, New College pioneered the first four-sided quad. 250 years later, they invented the first three-sided quad. So they have a bit of a history of typological firsts. The three-sided quad considered radical in its day because it was no longer prison-like. It had the fourth side looking onto a view of the landscape. You could see the city beyond the city walls. It was a much more inviting environment, and that perhaps reflected the changing nature of the college to the city and a much more welcoming aspect. And as part of the competition, which was run in 2015, we asked ourselves the question, at this glacial pace, how can architecture continue to become more open, more inviting? And the question no longer is about townsfolk or not, it's about elite universities actually being much more welcoming to a much more diverse student audience. So, what's the next iteration within this type? The site was the last remaining freehold that New College owned in the centre of Oxford, and it had a number of houses built in the 19th century, of which one is Grade 2 listed. This is also New College School, so for boys up to the age of 13. And this whole area is quite different to what you see just on the edge of the screen there, is a strip of 19th century suburban gardens. So this site came with a huge amount of planning restrictions. You must retain the character of the suburban belt from the 19th century. You must protect the house and its immediate curtilage. And the college wanted 100 student rooms and lots of other accommodation for studying, music performance. So up until the point that the competition was run, they had tried on 3 occasions just to demolish that one house. On each occasion, the city had turned them down, and so the site was effectively considered blighted. It was undevelopable. And the competition asked that for the first time, not to think about just this house, but to think about everything. How could a master plan for all of this property deliver the 100 rooms that the college wanted? And through our research, we'd come across this text that was written in the 1940s by Nicholas Pevsner, a very celebrated British architectural historian. It had disappeared for about 70 years and was found by a researcher in the Getty Institute in Los Angeles and published about 15 years ago. Visual planning and the picturesque is a polemic for how to insert modern architecture in historic settings. And it is illustrated with walks around Oxford, of which one goes around and through New College. And Pevsner contended that the picturesque attitude that landscape architects of the Romantic era in England had used was suitable for urban development. And this was seen as a kind of very English riposte to, say, the French Beaux-Arts, which would be towns ought to be organized around axial relationships, symmetry, a much more highly structured form of development that required a lot of destruction. In this instance, the idea is that every new piece of architecture is designed to frame what went before, that every piece of architecture is about a pleasurable, picturesque, painterly-like addition to the view, so that he would argue that this building was built in order for its relationship to this to be appreciated from this view. And here, this is a copy of the Bridge of Sighs from Venice at Hertford College, which was placed precisely to frame this view. So a kind of aesthetic ideal about increasing the visual pleasure, a bit like a painting in which the eye is able to enjoy the relationship of parts to wholes. So on the left, Great Quad, the first ever purpose-designed quad, four-sided garden quad. And then this is the site with our proposal. One three-sided south-facing court that would create three-sided quads, one for the school, two for the college. We replaced the house on the corner with a tower and a gatehouse that framed the longest possible view through the site. And this was the proposal at the competition stage, was that this relationship between landscape and architecture, between the inside and the outside, would go one step further, where there's greater equality between the gardens and the buildings. But that also served the purpose of allowing us to get as close as possible to each of the existing buildings so that we could achieve this actually incredible density that the client required. In order to give the architecture almost a kind of baroque expression vis-à-vis its curvature, we then worked with a structural engineer to come up with a stone block that visually would appear to curve even more than the building plan. And this is the sketch that the structural engineer Price and Myers made at the competition stage, and these are the technical drawings about 8 years later, where every stone was cut and CNC milled to achieve this kind of folding, curving effect. And then the roof was evolved during the construction process, where it went from concrete to timber. This meant that we were able to reduce a huge amount of carbon embodied in the build, which led to it getting a British Institute of Civil Engineers Carbon Champion Award, which is because if you have a university as a client, they have people who will spend their time doing all of the very difficult numbers to prove the case. And this is one of my favorite drawings from the project. This is a drawing that uses an algorithm to pack all of these pieces into shipping crates in order to minimize waste. And again, a bit like the house, I'm going to just do a quick walk through the site. So the new tower that marks out as a collegiate site, the gateway that frames the view deepest into the site, past the listed house, the new buildings framing the existing trees, the shoulders of the new building combining with the old to create new courts. And this is the kind of full expression of the architecture at the center of the site. There's about 24 gargoyles and grotesques that all, or most of them are figures of animals that are threatened by the climate crisis. And here you can see the 100 rooms over 3.5, 4 floors with larger shared rooms. And that's what makes it a quad rather than a residential building, in that it has all of these other uses with it. With routes for the public, so a lot of these shared rooms, the auditoria, are actually used throughout the academic year for public events. And this is the route down from that entrance to a gallery and this foyer where all of the student rooms meet the public spaces to use this auditorium, which is here. And this is a study space. So this is working up through the plans. You can see the student rooms, and this is the school. So again, the shoulder of the building completes a court for the school with a party wall, which actually has a few breaks in it, so if they ever want to combine the buildings in the future, they could. And the roof, in order to follow the geometry of those timber beams, the structural engineer used an algorithm to tessellate 3 to 7-sided polygons to follow the line with minimal joints. So, yeah, you can see that's now the school court, and the next image is from the playground, which was a car park when we arrived. And then, again, you can see the tiled roof, and these large rooms we made under the roof, like this new school hall. So there's classrooms under the roof and this new school hall. And the tower, which is kind of folly-like, there was a committee of architects working for the city, and that's what you want in life, is a committee of architects. Your tower's not tall enough. Of course it was, thank you. Because we had a much shorter tower at the competition stage, and in the end, it was the view of the city that in order to be one of the dreaming spires, it should be taller. And at the top of the tower is a pangolin, which perhaps is a record of it being built during COVID, where the poor pangolin was a much maligned, perceived cause of the disease. Right, so you like that one? Thanks, because I think I didn't start at past. I'm at an hour from when you arrived. So now it's the 2 Belgian projects, which are really important. So I'm going to go at a bit of a pace, just to not keep you here too long. And I should say I'm incredibly grateful, to Bovenbouw, Noah, Asli Cicek, my collaborators who are here. I think British architects are incredibly fortunate to be able to enter competitive processes in Belgium. And I think, if you didn't know it, Belgians are incredibly generous in supporting international collaborations, and the procurement strategy is admired everywhere. I'm giving a talk in Oxford about the Vlaams Bouwmeister to see whether we can convince Oxford City to be more enlightened, because it's not reciprocated, sadly. We come here and enjoy the opportunities, and the British procurement system is pretty arcane in comparison. But anyway, this is, I'm going to say a bit about Hasselt Beguinage that we did with Bovenbouw, and also Landinzicht, Bjorn Gielen, the landscape architect, and Bollinger Groman on the structural engineering. And it's just finished, but it's not yet fully photographed, but you'll probably see more photographs of it this evening than you have done on Instagram. So Hasselt, a kind of market town with this beguinage near the center. And it once had the tallest building at its center, this incredible church, which was sadly bombed by the Allied forces. That's what we did contribute in the Second World War. And this is a very beautiful drawing recording its state, and it was like this up until the competition. So this is a model of the proposal. I mean, the pink does stray into Francesca Torza's Z33, but it's fair to say they could be seen as a piece, and the province of Limburg, our client, was the client for both. So this is the beguinage, and the proposal was around making a publicly accessible park for the first time, thinking how to use the ruins for public needs, and bringing the architecture faculty of the University of Hasselt into the former beguinage. And these are the kind of drawings that we were producing in order to demonstrate that you didn't need to do very much to the ruin in order to turn it into something very generous. And I was there. It opened a week ago, and it was the most pleasing experience to see townsfolk walking through it, students sitting around it. I went on one occasion, there was several music performances and 200 people sitting in it. On another, just people reading. So very much as the drawing hoped. Dirk from Bovenbouw, where he pointed out that this is some memory of Francesca Torzo's facade, but it has a a fountain that can be drained for events. And then, crucially, at the competition stage, we proposed that there would be a belvedere, a tower, that would reinstate the height of the church in this site, such that, once again, the béguinage is perceivable from a distance across the town, and it's a kind of welcoming gesture. So, returning the institution to the kind of centrality, and it feels now it has uses that are truly public and truly open, and once again can be part of the kind of life of the town. And not only did we introduce the tower, we opened up the building. So in the roof, very large dormers were introduced so that this could become studio spaces for Hasselt University architecture students. And then these are drawings from early stages showing the tower winking across the street and opening up the gates to now become a path that cuts through and out the other side of the béguinage. So a public destination. And here, there are lots of parallels with Oxford, the idea of institutions function to segregate and the desire to unify, and that one can maintain the wall, but through a kind of language of perforation, make these different uses come together. And this is a drawing of the mouth of the tower and the view one could enjoy. And these are much more involved drawings about the adaptation of every corner of the béguinage for different uses. So lecture theatres here, a small museum. I should mention Joris Willems. I don't know if you hear, Joris was the project architect. Extraordinary work, incredible dedication for years to realize this project. And trying to respond to every fact of what we found, such as a fireplace that had been removed, and then lining that like a drawing with black stone. The large dormer windows that brought light into the roof spaces here. And this is one of my favorite bits. The old balusters stitched into new oak balustrades. I guess you can't do this everywhere, but in an architecture school, I think it's worth it. And it reminds me of Alison and Peter Smithson again, who, when they designed the extension to Bath University's architecture faculty, there were lots of eccentric bits of architecture that they claimed were for teaching purposes. And so I feel like certainly this would cause a few conversations in the future. So last but not least, so this is the scheme that we won in competition with Noah and Asli Cicek last year. And there's actually quite a wide team of ELD, name partners, Gewählt Sicht. Many of you may know the building, so this was the open call. An incredible collection of contemporary art in a building that is outlived its function. Kind of, in terms of like what does one read in the identity of it, it's not exactly the most welcoming of appearances. I always thought it looked like an Italian fascist railway station, but it has an incredible location. So the building you're seeing here is at this end. There was the potential in the brief for doubling the museum to the other end, and a number of other uses around an incredible flower hall from a World Fair site at the beginning of the 20th century. And these are the four shortlisted entrants, and the point of showing these is the scheme top left, which is the Noah Astrid and our scheme, is from a very different perspective to the other three. And I think that fundamentally speaks to a different approach, which was to understand the museum, the park, as part of a much wider urban experience. That the idea was to make encountering art like encountering aspects of the landscape as part of a journey. And I think I should mention Philip Ursprung from ETH also wrote very beautifully about this new way of thinking about artworks within SMAC as a consequence of this much broader conception. We also looked at the history of the site, and these are all the layers, this kind of palimpsest, and crucially, there's a gate left here. This is the only bit of this fort that was once on the site before it was re-landscaped using an English picturesque formula to become the largest park in the town today. And here it is. It's slightly forgotten. It has no function. It is one of many little architectures that surround the Flower Hall and SMAC. And it was drawings like these and a lot of walking around the site that led us to the scheme and the kind of gesture that if you arrive from the railway station to get to the town, and this is the main walking route, in the future you would literally walk through the buildings. So to visit SMAC, you would come through the Flower Hall, and that would make the entrance to the building inside the hall. So this is this diagonal gesture, and there's that gatehouse which was unhappily left behind, and it is now the entrance from the town into the complex, which is why the view of those four is completely reoriented from the view from the front, which is what was expected, to the view of this route that incorporates the existing fragments of the architecture. This is the Flower Hall, extraordinary piece of architecture that currently there's investigations for how it could be repurposed. But the next bit is the kind of technical bit, and this is Gewählensicht. And I think the brief suggests that renovation is not recommended. So that's the client brief. And we had to ask for the study from the client explaining exactly why renovation is not recommended. And if you can remember from the images, actually 2 out of the 4 finalists demolished the building, as was expected in the brief. Now, I think it was Anne Fontaine probably who insisted that we couldn't demolish the building, as in, I think there's a general view that wouldn't it be great to keep it, but I think we took a position that Gewählensicht was able to demonstrate. Now, I'm not going to go through all this, but what I can tell you is each of these illustrate why it is, in the long term, more cost-effective to keep the building in order to, and here, this is the kind of performance gap between spending the money now and seeing it being spent over the entire life of the building, that at a point it makes complete sense, and that this is the impact of different types of heating as you get down to a kind of highly insulated building that uses passive air conditioning, and that basically it demonstrates that over a 60-year life, actually it's incredibly efficient to keep the building. And so then the question became one of also language. If we're keeping this building and we want to minimize the embodied carbon going forward, how can we reuse it? And if you remember those short stories about buildings cannibalizing other buildings, well, that's exactly what we proposed, that we would carry out an audit of all the materials on the facade. We would work out how they could be recomposed in new relationships and design new facades that were no longer railway stations. They were appropriate for a contemporary art museum. So here you can see those fragments of stone that were once vertical on the facades, now framing large openings. The inside of the museum has a much more lightweight face, so you get this contrast. So here's the red brick of one building, which has a different brick dimension to the beige of another. So the buildings that were adjacent, this material is now stacked. And here you can see this lightweight face that's almost a bit like a folly in the landscape, this kind of picturesque stage that activates the interior of the flower hall, creating these kinds of spaces that all connect now to the park. And this is the kind of memory of the flower hall. I think it's being used for Gymkhana here. And the possibility now of seeing the former museum from its new wing, this kind of doubling across a public foyer. So that's the end of the talk. I did say I'd happily take questions. Apparently they're not common, but there is a roving microphone, so I'm very happy to take questions, unless everyone wants to go get a drink. So yeah, just a reminder of where we started. And this is a plug. Our first monograph is coming out in November, Stages, and it's edited by Maurits Kohn, who some of you may know, because he was the curator at De Singel for many years. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, this one back.
You argued about the smug building, that it would be a better idea to keep the big hall. Meanwhile, you demolish the existing entrance building, and you talked about the style of the fascist train station, but I guess that's not the only argument to demolish this part of the building whilst arguing that the other should be kept. Just, I was wondering what is the reflection behind it?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question, because it makes me think that I didn't explain myself well enough. Because the structure of this building is retained. So arguably its most carbon, the most embodied in carbon in the building is retained in its future life, and it's only the brickwork that is removed, which allows it to be newly insulated, which brings up the performance to the kind of level that you can use very low energy heating and cooling infrastructure. And if you combine those two things together, it far outperforms either an existing building with high energy environmental kit to compensate, or demolishing to create an entirely new high performance building, both inside and outside. And it was that kind of page of text that set out that argument, which clearly was not obvious to the client, and I have to say it wasn't obvious to us. It was only and I think this is what architects are probably good at, it was the feeling that we ought to be keeping the building, and it didn't make sense, given its scale and the amount of material in it, to presume it should be demolished. And then it was a case of a technical team being able to actually prove numerically that this was the case. And And what's interesting is I was asked to talk about this project in London a week ago, 2 weeks ago, for a kind of retrofit first conference, because this is seen as very progressive and almost unachievable in the UK. The idea that there would be circular construction at this scale for a public building, and I think sadly Brexit has a large part to play in that since we've become decoupled from EU regulation, there's almost little kind of motivation to pursue these kind of ambitious projects. But did that answer the question? Okay, thank you. And apologies for the lack of detail on the build-up. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Hi.
Does the title postmodernism mean something to you, or is it just something that was put on the color green and the brickwork of James Sterling-like architecture in the beginning of your career?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, interesting question. I suppose, certainly didn't set out to, do anything post-modernism. What I do take from it is that there was something about the house, something aesthetic, that caused Rowan Moore, who's the Observer architecture critic, to want to coin a term. And I think that's got something to do with this, if you go back to the slides at the beginning, like, how do you make things that are figurative, that are kind of memorable? And I think the house is trying quite hard to have all of those parts that make architecture, on the one hand, communicable and therefore memorable. And I think that is possibly what would cause someone to try and give it a moniker, because it appears to be doing something. Now, I'm happy if it's seen to be achieving unexpected ways of reaching the parts that other architectures couldn't. The term, I don't know. I don't think he's going to write much more on that particular topic. But, yeah. But it's true that our work has generally been included in surveys about postmodernism or postmodern revivals. And I guess certainly there's a lot of references to pre-modern architecture in the work, which I guess 1980s postmodernism, or the 60s to 80s, was the last time there was a lot of discussion about that. Any more? No? Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you.